Hello, fellow phonograph nerds. Today I'm going to speak to you about one of the leading and longest-lasting phone singers, Dan W. Quinn. Daniel William Quinn was born in 1860 in New York City to Benjamin Bernard and Sabina Leonora Quinn. As a young boy, Daniel received his only singing lessons as a choir boy at the Church of the Heavenly Rest, an Episcopalian church notable for its architecture and the fact that 21st President Chester Arthur was buried there. He couldn't have possibly sang there long, but regardless, he became quite proficient in music. In around 1867, the family packed up and moved to San Francisco, likely in search of work or housing. They must not have found whatever they were looking for there, as Dan, his mother, and his sister moved back to New York just over 10 years later. After arriving back in New York, Dan, now 17, followed in his father's footsteps and began working as an iron molder. Sometime after this, he started a second job, moonlighting as a singer, performing at local functions. Just a few years later, he married his wife of 50 years, Mary Jane Ritchie. They had 5 children, the youngest of which was born in 1901. In 1892, the event that would lead to Mr. Quinn being well known to me and people like me transpired, and instead of explaining it myself, I will quote Quinn's own retelling of the events from a letter written in the 1930s. In January 1892, I was engaged to entertain a political club in Hoboken. One of the features was a man who gave a phonograph exhibition and invited everyone to make a voice test. Many folks got up and sang a song or recited something, and he reproduced the result. The phonograph was a great novelty at the time, and these records created a lot of amusement, though most of them were terrible. I was loath to make an attempt, but they all begged me, and I finally did. I was lucky enough to have a voice and style of singing that were just made for recording, so I may say without egotism that I was a veritable riot. I don't know what it was about my voice that made it go, as I always sang so quietly. There must have been some latent penetrating power. Anyway, the operator urged me to go to one of the laboratories to make a real test. He started his recording career at the New York Phonograph Company and immediately took to the new art form. Here he fondly recalls one of his first recording experiences. I'll never forget one of the first records I made. It was Down Went McGinty. I was singing from memory, and when I reached the chorus, I forgot my lines and exclaimed, "Oh Lord, I forgot it." This record was treasured by the company for a long time. He was clearly well loved by everyone there. What would have been considered a throwaway fluke take to most staff was considered a treasured keepsake to the management at the New York Phono Company. He wasn't at the New York Company long before he started hearing about other companies and moved to the more successful New Jersey company in Newark. According to Quinn himself, it is there in New Jersey that he started really working hard, sight reading, and recording every hit regardless of whether he liked it or not. He mentions that his contemporaries took quite some time to record the latest songs, so he, as a sight reader, couldn't help but to record every new song that came out. As a result, he was the first to record many songs well known even to us today. But it also meant that the majority of his catalog consists of music that even folks from back then wouldn't have recognized. He became quite popular at the New Jersey company, and the manager, Victor Emerson, once told Quinn, "Dan, I wish it were possible for you to stand there and record that song 1,000 times." This was back in the days before masters, when you would have to record a song repeatedly to meet demands. Quinn once mentioned singing one song over 1,000 times in 1 week. Quinn continued to gain popularity, and by September of 1890 he was asked to travel to Washington to make records for the Columbia Phonograph Company. Quinn was ecstatic to make records for Columbia and immediately traveled to Washington to do so. He arrived early in the day, tired and covered in grime from car smoke. But he went directly to the Columbia headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue and after basic introductions began making test records. The event itself must not have been that noteworthy, but it wasn't long after being accepted that the first situation of note at Columbia would take place. Quote, "One happening I remember with particular vividness. Mr. Child was then taking records at Columbia, and after a few tests I started in and made a few rounds of songs. He took 5 records off the machine and left me for quite a while. After he returned, we went right on with the work, and nothing more was said of the incident. One day, after I had run my total of rounds up to 200 for the week, Mr. Child asked if I remembered his going out with the 5 records. He then told me he had suspected I was lying down on the job because I sang with so little effort, but on taking those samples down to the basement and playing them, he had found them all good and loud. While singing for Columbia and Washington, Quinn did quite a lot of work for Emil Berliner. He had a place just a little further down Pennsylvania Avenue, and after he finished his work for the day at Columbia, he went down the street and made test records for Berliner. Quinn remembered Berliner very fondly in his letters to Jim Walsh. Quote, "Here was another fine man. It was a treat to see him working on his disc gramophone. He would turn the old crank round and say to me, 'Dan, isn't that fine?' Really and truly, it wasn't so good, but it was his baby and he could foresee wonderful progress. I'd sing drill guitars, drill, and when I came to the chorus, he'd take a big stick and bang it over a barrel to get the effect of a dynamite explosion. It is very fascinating to see how fondly he remembers his experiences with Berliner. There was clearly a real connection between the two, and I'm sure that had Berliner's business not been shut down in 1899, Quinn would have made tons of records for him. His work for Columbia was only for 2 weeks, so by the 15th he was on his way back to New York. He arrived that evening tired and sick with a cold. He had an arrangement that Tuesday to sing a specialized list of 200 songs for the New England Phonograph Company in Boston, Massachusetts, and even with his cold he happily fulfilled his obligation. He arrived in Boston on Monday, and that next morning, cold and all, he was in the studio singing. He made 50 songs that day, and with each recording his throat cleared. His cough subsided, and he started to feel better. He continued that way for 4 days, singing 50 songs a day and feeling better with each one. By Friday, when he was ready to go home, his cold was completely gone and he had recovered fully. In his letters to Walsh, he says he sang out the cold, and I think that's a fun, folksy idea. Later that year, he signed an exclusive contract with the United States Phonograph Company in New Jersey. Despite this agreement, he makes recordings for multiple other companies, including the Chicago Talking Machine Company, Berliner's Company, Columbia Phonograph Company, the New England Company, and the Baltimore Company. In an article in the Phonoscoper magazine, Quinn states that he was in a contract with the U.S. Phonograph Company for 2 years, but also states to have made thousands of recordings for the aforementioned companies. He also mentions making 300 records a day for 2 years at the United States Company, so it's not as if he had time to secretly slip away and make other recordings in his off time. Regardless of what happened, we do know that by December 1896, he was free of any contract and able to record for any company. This seems to be around the time he starts recording for Edison as the earliest Edison cylinders I've seen by him are from 1897 or later. After a year of freelancing, Quinn signed yet another contract, this time for the Columbia Phonograph Company, who had moved to New York the year prior. The contract was only for a year, and as soon as it expired, he was back on the circuit making more records for other companies. Later that year, Berliner's company was forced out of business by Columbia. Berliner's patents were sold off to Eldridge Johnson, and with them he opened up his own company in 1900. It was first called the Consolidated Talking Machine Company, and during that time Quinn was one of the first people to record for them. Also during that time, Quinn did at least one session for the new Lambert Talking Machine Company in Chicago, who made plastic indestructible cylinders. He kept working hard for all major companies in the United States, but by 1905, the standardization of molded cylinders and the changing styles made his services less desirable, and by 1906 he retired from recording altogether. During this time, he kept working as an entertainer and singer at functions, but he faded from public view almost entirely. He and his wife lived happily and peacefully like this for some time, and in 1916 Quinn even made a comeback to recording. He made a handful of recordings, but unfortunately they must not have been very popular, and by 1918 he was retired again. This time he seems to have retired from singing entirely and started working as a booking agent, a job he held until his death in 1938. As a booking agent, he and his wife became known and loved by the new generation of vaudeville performers. His wife, Mary Jane Ritchie, was so well loved by them that they referred to her as Mother Quinn, and must have given a number of fellows their big breaks and helped them through the tough and often cold industry. I haven't found any accounts of this happening, but one can only assume that they did some great things to be seen as parents by young entertainers. During the Great Depression, Quinn was hit hard, but the financial troubles didn't seem to last long. I will now quote to you from two letters written by Quinn to Jim Walsh a few months apart in 1932. Been very successful until old man depression took a whack at me, and running true to the times, I got a setback. If the good Lord will keep me in good health, I'm going to work hard to recover some of the lost ground. Business has taken on a little boom, which gladdens my heart so much as times have been terribly bad. And now that things are showing a little animation, I am spurred on to greater efforts in order to replenish the exchequer, and thereby the better enabled to keep the traditional wolf from trespassing too far over the sill of our domicile. As stated earlier, financial woes and worries didn't seem to last long, as in only a few months his whole outlook seemed to change. Despite his age, he never gave up and kept working hard booking concerts until his financial situation improved. Other phonograph singers were hit much harder by the depression, but Quinn seemed to be wise enough to keep financially stable during the rough times. During this time, he even mentions to Walsh that he wanted to write a book. Quote, I had thought of writing a book concerning my experiences both on the stage and phonograph, which surely would be mighty interesting reading. Of this I am certain, as many times I have related several little incidents setting the table on the roar, so to speak, and I have a fund of them. What a joy that would have been! It would have been the most valuable and useful book for phonograph nerds such as myself. But unfortunately, on the 7th of November 1938, Daniel William Quinn would pass away because of death being listed as intestinal cancer. He left behind 6 children, 11 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. His popularity faded over the years, and now is almost completely forgotten. Only phonograph nerds and music historians like myself know of his greatness, and though few care to listen, we do all we can to make him known to music lovers of all ages. If you're interested in hearing some of Quinn's records in full, check out my playlist in the description below. Thank you for watching.
I will be happy all my life because my baby told me that she'd be my wife. I love her more than days of yore, and I ain't gonna weep no more.